A courtroom ruling just dropped, and inside the palace walls you could almost feel the floor shift under the feet of the monarchy. Before we go any deeper into what this actually means for the royal family, make sure you're subscribed, because this one is going to reshape how people talk about the Windsors for a long time to come. What's wild about this isn't just that a court ruled against Camilla, it's not even the financial angle, although the financial angle is genuinely shocking. The real issue isn't money. The real issue is what the ruling exposed about trust, hierarchy, respect, and who inside that royal household actually gets to decide how the institution is run. And when you actually look at what happened versus how people inside the palace reacted, you start to understand why Princess Anne was visibly stunned, why the king went quiet, and why this moment feels heavier than the headlines let on. Here's the thing most of the coverage is going to miss. Court rulings involving the royal household almost never become public. Decades of palace tradition have built an invisible wall between the monarchy's internal finances and the public eye. That wall exists because the monarchy is funded by something called the sovereign grant, a yearly public allocation that supports the official duties of the working royals. It is essentially the public's money given to the crown so the crown can function. And the assumption has always been that the people spending that money are doing so with care, with restraint, and with respect for the institution that handed it to them. So when a court publicly rules that someone inside that household misused those funds, it doesn't just embarrass one person. It unsettles the entire power structure of how the monarchy has quietly run itself for over a century. Let's talk about what actually happened. The ruling came down from a court reviewing how specific royal household expenditures had been handled over the past several years. The court found that a portion of the funds had been used in ways that fell outside the expected scope of official royal duty. The language in the ruling was, by legal standards, firm but restrained. It didn't accuse anyone of personal corruption. It didn't frame it as theft. But it did establish that the spending in question didn't match the standards the royal household is supposed to operate under. And that distinction matters because the monarchy's entire financial system works on trust. The sovereign grant is reviewed. The household accounts are audited behind closed doors. The royal offices receive their funding in good faith. And when a court publicly rules that the trust was broken, even in a partial way, the symbolic damage is enormous. That's what made this sting. Because Camilla isn't some peripheral figure. She is the queen consort. She sits at the literal center of the monarchy's daily operations. She attends engagements. She hosts dignitaries. She represents the crown at the highest levels of state. And the public has always accepted her in that role because the institution asked them to. So when the court says that she was the one who authorized expenditures that didn't match the standard, the reaction isn't just financial shock. It's institutional shock. It's the realization that the person closest to the king may have been using the crown's resources in ways that hadn't been properly sanctioned. And that matters because legitimacy has always been the monarchy's most valuable currency. You can't print legitimacy. You can't vote it into existence. You earn it through behavior, through restraint, through the quiet discipline of doing the job without making yourself the story. And in this moment, the court ruling quietly said that the queen consort had become part of the story in a way she was never supposed to be. Now let's talk about Princess Anne because this is where the human reaction becomes the heart of the story. Anne has spent her entire life doing something that nobody in the public really pays attention to. She has been the monarchy's quiet spine. She shows up, she does the work. She carries out more engagements in a year than almost anyone else in the family. She visits charities, she opens hospitals, she travels, she delivers speeches, she never complains, she never demands attention, and she never ever lets the institution become the story because of her behavior. Anne represents something very specific inside the royal family. She represents the old school version of what it means to be royal: duty without celebrity, service without spectacle, loyalty without reward. So when the court ruling came down and the spotlight shifted toward the queen consort, Anne's reaction wasn't a surprise emotionally, it was a surprise only in intensity. She was stunned, not because the ruling was unexpected, but because she had spent decades quietly protecting an institution that was now being publicly exposed as having been managed by someone she works beside every single day in a way that didn't meet her standard. That's where the atmosphere shifted, because Anne understands something about the monarchy that most people outside the palace never fully grasp. The royal household runs on a shared language. That language includes tone, restraint, discretion, hierarchy, and a kind of emotional discipline that is invisible to anyone who hasn't lived inside it. When Camilla stepped into her role as queen consort, she inherited that language. The palace expected her to learn it. The public expected her to learn it. And for years, she largely did. But the court ruling suggested something that Anne had almost certainly noticed long before the rest of the country. At some point behind closed doors, the discipline had slipped. The spending had drifted. The tone had shifted. And the monarchy had begun to behave in small but visible ways like an institution that was treating its public funding less as a sacred trust and more as a personal resource. Anne saw this. Anne noticed this. And Anne was apparently stunned that the world had finally been allowed to see it too. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the reaction inside the palace wasn't uniform. The king's people went quiet. The official household, that invisible network of staff, advisors, and ceremonial officials who keep the monarchy functioning on a daily basis, sent out careful internal messages. The Lord Chamberlain's office, which is essentially the operational nerve center of royal life, began reviewing internal procedures. But nobody was rushing to defend Camilla publicly. Nobody in the family was standing beside her. Nobody was issuing an emotional statement about loyalty or love or decades of service. The silence itself was the loudest signal. And in the monarchy, silence is never empty. Silence is choreography. So why was the reaction so cold? Why didn't Charles defend his wife the way he has defended her for nearly 2 decades? Through scandals, through public skepticism, through the slow rebuilding of her image. That's the hidden meaning layer of this entire story. Because defending Camilla in this moment would be, for the king, constitutionally expensive. The court ruling wasn't a tabloid headline. It was a legal decision that said, in plain language, that the household hadn't been properly managed, and the king cannot publicly stand against a court ruling without making the institution weaker. So the king did what the monarchy always does when the institution is at risk. He stepped back, he protected the crown, and in doing so, he allowed Camilla to carry the weight alone. That is the most painful part of this entire story, because Camilla has spent almost her entire public life being the buffer between the king and the country's judgment. She stood beside him through the destruction of his first marriage. She endured years of public ridicule. She walked with him into Westminster Abbey with quiet dignity. She became queen consort not because the country initially wanted her, but because Charles loved her. And the monarchy eventually learned to accept her. So when the court ruling came down, it didn't just land on Camilla's shoulders. It landed on the shoulders of every quiet sacrifice she had made to become the woman the crown needed her to be. And that is why this moment hurts more than the legal language suggests. You also have to look at who was not surprised. Princess Anne was not surprised. The senior staff inside the official household were not surprised. The constitutional advisors who quietly tracked the monarchy's finances were not surprised. The Lord Chamberlain's office, which has historically been one of the most disciplined administrative institutions in British public life, was almost certainly aware that some spending had drifted outside the expected lines. What surprised them wasn't the fact of misuse. What surprised them was that it had become public. Because in the monarchy's logic, problems are supposed to be handled internally. They are supposed to be absorbed. They are supposed to be quietly corrected. They are not supposed to be exposed to a courtroom or a country. And so, the real shock wasn't the ruling. It was the breach of the palace's oldest unspoken rule: never let the public see the seams. And that is why Princess Anne's stunned reaction carries so much weight. Because Anne has spent her lifetime protecting those seams. She attends the openings. She carries the schedules. She shows up for the unglamorous, the quiet, the difficult. She represents everything the monarchy claims to be when it talks about duty. And now, watching a court publicly expose a financial breach that should have been resolved internally, Anne was watching the institution she has given her life to being criticized for something that the institution itself should have prevented. That's what made it land harder than it looked. That's why this moment felt bigger than the headlines. The deeper symbolism here is also worth exploring because this is not just about money. This is about legitimacy. The crown's legitimacy is built on the visible idea that those closest to it understand the difference between public service and personal privilege. The sovereign grant is not a salary. It is not a perk. It is a stewardship. And stewardship has rules. Those rules are invisible most of the time, but they are absolute. When someone at the center of the monarchy forgets those rules or bends them or quietly treats them as flexible, the institution loses a piece of its claim to public trust. And the monarchy cannot survive losing pieces of its claim to public trust. It survives because the country agrees to believe in it, and the country agrees to believe in it because the people at the top behave in ways that confirm the country's belief. When that confirmation fails, even quietly, even in a courtroom, the belief becomes slightly more fragile. And this is where the long-term implications come in, because William and Catherine are watching. They have been watching for years. They have been quietly positioning themselves as the future of the institution. They have been signaling, without ever saying a word, that the modern monarchy will look different from the current one: cleaner, more disciplined, more transparent, more careful about how the crown's resources are used. So a ruling like this, although it focuses on Camilla, doesn't just affect Camilla. It tells William and Catherine that the institution they are about to inherit still has unresolved internal tensions. It tells them that the monarchy they will lead requires a different kind of stewardship. And it tells the country that a generational shift in royal culture may already be quietly underway. That's the real takeaway. This wasn't about money. It was about trust. It was about the kind of institution the monarchy is going to be in the next 20 years. It was about whether the people closest to the crown understand the difference between serving it and using it. And the court's ruling, in its quiet, legal, restrained language, answered that question for the country in a way that the palace had, for years, avoided answering for itself. The final symbolic moment in this story will play out quietly. No dramatic press conference, no resignation, no public statement of shame. Instead, the official household will adjust. Procedures will be reworded. Internal reviews will be quietly expanded. The spending will be corrected. And Camilla will almost certainly continue in her role because removing a queen consort over a financial ruling would create an even larger constitutional crisis. But nothing will be the same. Because now every future decision she makes carries the shadow of this moment. Every future statement about her role in the household will carry an unspoken asterisk. And inside the palace, every future conversation about the sovereign grant, about expenditures, about the line between public duty and private access, will carry this ruling like an invisible weight. Princess Anne will go back to her work. She will continue. She will not let this moment derail what she has spent decades building. And that, more than the legal language, more than the headlines, more than the courtroom drama, is the part that matters. Because the monarchy doesn't survive because of its titles or its ceremonies. It survives because of the people inside it who continue to show up, who continue to carry the weight, and who continue to do the work even when the institution itself stumbles. What do you think? Do you believe the court was right to make the ruling public, or do you think the palace should have been allowed to handle this quietly inside its own walls? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is the kind of conversation the monarchy needs more people to be having. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.